I'll go ahead and get started with the history of the disease. It started in Dawson County, Nebraska in 1969, which is near Lexington. It was reported in 3 cornfields that year. By 1970, it was in 9 counties in Nebraska, so it started moving pretty quickly already as soon as they found it. By 1971, they had 15 counties in Nebraska and 1 county in Iowa. By the end of the 1970s, 1979, 53 counties in Nebraska had it, and they reported it in 8 states, including Colorado, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. So it had spread pretty quickly over those first about 10 years. Well, after that, get to the later 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, we really didn't see a whole lot of it. It kind of disappeared, was gone, nobody was seeing a lot of it. And then about 2005, 2006, they kind of started seeing it again in the panhandle of Nebraska, southeast Colorado, and southeast Wyoming, and northeast Colorado. So they started seeing it out there, and since then it's been slowly progressing, actually fairly quickly progressing across the Corn Belt. It was reported in Indiana in 2008, and Texas in 2010, and we've got reports of it in 2 provinces in Canada. So it's really spread pretty quickly over the last 5 years. Kind of the next thing we'll go into what you see. So I know a lot of you said you've seen Goss's wilt, but I bet none of you have seen this systemic wilt, at least from this area of the state. We really haven't seen a lot of this around here. When you get to the panhandle, we see a lot of this. We've had reports of 20 to 30% stand reductions in fields out in the panhandle of Nebraska and northeast Colorado. So it's a pretty big issue for them. I mean, you're losing that much of your stand, you're going to lose a considerable amount of yield. And with this, what it does is basically the bacteria gets into the vascular bundles and plugs them up, so you're not getting water and nutrient movement through the plant, basically getting the wilt and killing the plant. I guess one more thing on the wilt phase is why we think we only see that out in the western Nebraska more is because we're going to have a lot more early season hail and sandblasting, which opens up that plant. And we think that this Goss's wilt bacteria needs a wound to infect. So you get that hail at about V4, V5, all your nodes are stacked up, that bacteria gets into the plant, it's pulled down into that stack of nodes, well then basically that entire plant's dead then once it's all plugged up. And around here we don't seem to have near as much of the early season hail, and we might have a little bit of stuff, but it's not near as much, and there's just not as much inoculum source around this area as we see out in western Nebraska. The more common thing we see is this here. From these pictures you can kind of see what they call a shiny exudate, which is basically an bacteria oozing out of the leaf. So you'll see this on the surface of the leaf. It's kind of a giveaway. Another thing is these discontinuous water-soaked spots, which are basically these black freckles on the edges of the leaf. And you'll see that's a pretty dead giveaway for it being Goss's wilt when you see that on the lesions. Talk a little bit about yield reduction. I guess obviously if you're going to have a 20 to 30% stand reduction, you're going to have a very high yield reduction at the end of the year. But when you're kind of focused on this area where you just got the blight phase, you kind of see something. This picture is a pretty good illustration of it. If you look here, you can see this here is really, the whole top of the canopy is just dead, dried up. Can't photosynthesize anymore. You're not going to have as high of a yield versus this one here that's still green, which is a resistant hybrid on this half versus a very susceptible hybrid here. And we've got documented evidence of up to 50% yield reduction just from this, like the blight phase here, and reports of over 60% yield reduction. So this is a very serious disease and something really to watch for when you're managing your field. So reasons why we think the disease may have reemerged. Changes in the pathogen. Why has this disease become so aggressive? Is there something in the pathogens that's changed? Is it our farming practices? But it is a possibility that something in that pathogen may have changed to make it more aggressive and make it move the way it has across the Corn Belt. Less resistance is another possibility. Question?
No.
Okay. Less resistance. So basically we had this disease in the 70s, early 80s, so everybody was testing for it. They were putting out very resistant hybrids, so we didn't see a lot of it. Well, then it kind of started to go away through the late 80s, 90s, 2000s. It wasn't practical for these seed companies to be testing for this. They wanted to put their funds, focus on other things because it was issues they were having at that time. So they kind of went away from testing for it, and then when it came back, there was probably a lot more susceptible material out there than what there previously had been. Continuous corn. As I said before, the inoculum is in the residue. So basically when you have corn on corn, you have that residue there. All it takes is, a little bit of rain, a little bit of splash, it's up on the leaves. And then, if you get a high wind or a hail, it's already there. It goes ahead and gets in the plant. Alternative hosts. There are at least 4 species we know of that this can live on, including green foxtail, shattercane, sorghum, and eastern gamagrass. Now, eastern gamagrass probably isn't something you'd commonly have as a weed in your field, but it is something you may see in the road ditches. So just as, you know, as close as a road ditch, you might have that growing there, which could be hosting this. So even if you do rotate, keeping your weeds down is very important. Conservation tillage, it kind of goes along with the continuous corn, where you have, you know, if you maybe till under 10-20% of your residue just to help it break down a little faster, we still have a lot of residue on the surface where this inoculum is being held. So we're not advocating, you know, change your production practices, but basically the more residue on the surface, the more inoculum is there for next year. The next thing I'll go into is kind of my project, what I'm doing for my thesis here. And what we have done in collaboration with Iowa State is put together a survey trying to highlight agronomic factors that are affecting the progression of Goss's wilt across the Corn Belt. So we kind of ask questions about field history, you know, what has been your tillage scheme in the past, what's your rotation. Irrigation management, is a sprinkler pivot, you know, is that splashing enough bacteria down to be causing more infection than subsurface irrigation or flood irrigation? Disease injury and severity, or disease history and severity. If you had this disease in the past, if you haven't had it in the past, what other factor has brought it to your field? We're trying to find out these things. Insect and weed pressure, as you mentioned with the insects feeding, we don't know that, but that is part of the survey to see, okay, if all you had was insect feeding for injury, is that how the Goss's wilt got in? Trying to figure that out. Fertilizers and pesticides applied, we don't really know anything on that yet. It's just kind of something we're throwing out there just to see what we get back, to see if there is any correlation to what people are putting on their fields, and just basically other agronomic practices.
Over the last couple of years, we have initiated some trials looking at different products and different application timings to try to capture something that would help us reduce disease severity. And so using backpack sprayers, those are CO2 pressurized sprayers. We're not able to do this by aerial application at this point. And using mechanically injured inoculated plants. Now when I'm saying inoculated, I'm talking about us introducing the pathogen to the plant. Okay. Now we've done this in both 2009 and 2010 using 3 application timings: pre-inoculation, at or near inoculation within a couple or 3 days, and post-inoculation, which would be within usually about a week. In 2009, we looked at 2 different hybrids that were 105-day relative maturity, one resistant and one susceptible. In 2010, we more than quadrupled the size of the trial, and so we doubled the number of hybrids, having both 105-day and 110-day hybrids, one each having resistance and one susceptible. And we conducted this work in Gothenburg at the Monsanto Water Utilization Center. And knowing what you know about the pathogen's ability to survive over winter in residue, you can imagine the reluctance that people may have in allowing us to come in and inoculate an area to do something like this. And so we were forced to go to an area where we did have a resident population and pretty significant disease in the area. And so during 2009 out at Gothenburg, obviously we always have to have some negative and positive controls and checks. And so that's what you see in part of this graph. Now, this says Goss's wilt AUDPC, that's area under the disease progress curve. And that's a mathematical way that we use to combine disease ratings over time to make it simpler to interpret. So what you need to know is the larger the number, the more disease we have. Okay? And so looking at this graph, you'll notice that initially here we didn't have much disease. And that's because in this first half of the graph, we did not inoculate it with the pathogen. No pathogen was introduced here, and we didn't even injure it in these first 3 treatments so that we could measure the natural background level of disease in that area. So we could see how we impacted some of our treatments. Next, we did have injured treatments out there subjected to the natural levels of bacteria. And so when they were injured, we didn't really see any significant increase in disease. So we did have disease, but at very low levels. So we felt confident that what we were getting was mainly in response to our own activities. And so where we injured and introduced the pathogen, we did see significant disease. Now this is in the susceptible 105-day hybrid. And so the rating was a 7 out of 9, where the higher number being the more susceptible the plant. The treatments are listed at the bottom. Here we had no pesticide used, and then to the right of that we had either Kocide 3000. If you're not familiar with that product, that is a copper hydroxide product, and it is labeled for corn. It's more commonly used on some of our specialty crops like dry bean for some of those bacterial diseases, and maybe sugar beets and some other plants. And we've also got Headline on here. Now, Headline obviously is a fungicide, and although we weren't expecting direct bactericidal effects from that product, we wanted to capture any potential plant health benefits that we might be able to in an effort to try to overcome some of the infection. These treatments were made before infection or inoculation, and so that was within a week before inoculation. These two treatments were made after inoculation, and so that would have been within about a week after that. Well, we did have some statistical differences here, but really the one that I thought was most striking was the Kocide application after inoculation. This wasn't what we expected at all, because Kocide is a contact product. It is not absorbed into the plant and moves systemically, in contrast to most of the fungicides that we're using now, like Headline, Wilt. Those products are systemic and absorbed and move throughout the plant. Being a contact product, it will stay on the surface of the leaf, and so it does have the potential to be washed off during irrigation and rainfall. And so that's a potential loss there. If it's not washed off, you could have protection for 7 days, maybe up to 10 or so, maybe. Let's put the yield right beside it. And so these are the same treatments side by side. Oh, good, here we go. So same treatments. So one thing I want to point out right off the bat, these are yields in bushels per acre. And so you notice a tremendous yield impact based on the disease severity that we caused. So in the green bars to the right-hand side, we had up to, let's see, 70, 80 bushel yield losses due to the severity of the disease, okay, compared to where we only had marginal, very little disease due to the natural populations there at that location. Okay, so you did see tremendous yield differences there. But unfortunately, although you did see a little bit of a yield increase in that treatment that had disease reduction, it wasn't significantly different from the other treatments that we had up there. And so there was at least enough inconsistency that we lacked the statistical differences. These are the yields from the resistant hybrid. I'm going to show these in reverse order, so you can compare the yields of the two hybrids side by side. Okay, now obviously on the susceptible hybrid, we averaged about 200 bushels or so across the treatments in what we did not inoculate. And so the question earlier about the potential for yield drag in a resistant hybrid, looking at these results, in a resistant hybrid under the same disease pressure, we actually had much higher yields over here. Okay, now I doubt whether there was enough Goss's wilt naturally in that area to cause that type of a yield difference. But at least in the example between these two hybrids, we didn't see yield drag at all. Actually, there's probably some hybrid characteristics that were much better about this one. Here's those same treatments I mentioned to you earlier, the Kocide and Headline, before and after inoculation. We didn't see any differences, basically, is what I want to say about that. And nor over here. And when you look at disease severity in the resistant hybrid, obviously that hybrid did a much better job of reducing disease than the susceptible hybrid. And so much lower disease